Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was February 26th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Juan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is from Violant, and it is once again in that Varia register. And this is addressed to somebody who, in the first line, is identified only as Mosen Berenguer. There's a lot of Berengers out there, so luckily we have a little line underneath the main text. Dirigiter Berenguer Dolms militi. And that last word, militi, makes all the difference. It means, well, in direct translation from Latin, it means soldier, but the way it was used at this time, it means knight. So Violant is writing to a certain Berenguer. I think the last name is Dolms. And this person is a knight. This person is possibly like a knight for hire, although I'm not sure. I wasn't able to find anything about Berenguer Dolms to understand why he has been called upon to perform the service that he's being called upon to do in this letter. And so it's a bit of a mystery there why it is that we have this letter going out to a militi, a knight. But the purpose of having someone with some military training or some kind of armament becomes clear when we get into the letter itself. It turns out that there is another person named Jacme Quinta, and that person is a tax collector or some kind of fee collector. The word that's used for the funds that are being collected, that word is demandes. So demandes is a word that just means something like a request or a requirement. It's got a lot of different colloquial uses. So I was a little bit concerned that I might not be interpreting it correctly. Actually, let me clarify. I was concerned that Claude was not interpreting it correctly. I switched over to Claude from ChatGPT to see how Claude version Opus 4.6 would do with a translation from medieval Catalan, and Claude did really, really well. In fact, Claude was able to catch something that was stumping me. There was an abbreviation, it's in the fourth line, kind of in the middle, DRS, and with a macron above it, and I just could not figure out what was being abbreviated there. And Claude figured out that it was dinars. It was the unit of money. It hasn't come up all that much. Usually we're seeing florins as the unit of money, or maybe sous. And so to have dinars in the document, it's not super rare, but it's just something that I wasn't used to. And Claude found that. And then he also found something. Oh gosh, he said he. the chatbot Claude, it also found something that I really should have gotten when I was transcribing this, but I didn't. So in the, let's see, one, two, three, four, fifth line down, in the middle again, right before dia, is the word cascun. And I had looked at the second C and thought it was a T. You might be wondering what happened to Gemini as my go-to for doing transcription. Well, I did upload this letter into Gemini, and for some reason it just flubbed it horribly. Like, I can't quite figure out why Gemini worked so well on some occasions, and then on other occasions it just is a disaster. So it was mistaking a lot of the abbreviations, so it was getting a lot of the P words wrong, and I just gave up and I said, you know what, it's going to take longer for me to go through and correct the Gemini errors than it would be for me to just go ahead and transcribe this letter myself. So we'll give Gemini another chance tomorrow and see what happens. But yeah, Gemini is kind of this uneven experience. That's what I can say about that. And I haven't tried getting Claude to do a transcription from the image. We might try that at some point. Anyway, Claude came up with the conclusion that demandes was being used here as a term for the collection of funds, whether it's a fee or a tax. And I just wanted some confirmation about that, and Claude did a really good job of finding some scholarly literature that indeed confirms that demandes was used as a term for fund collection, that a demandes would be a word meaning you're going out and you're doing collections. So what's happening in this letter is that Jacme Quinta is the tax collector, and he's gonna need a little bit of muscle as he goes around Catalonia and demands that certain people pay what the crown feels is owed to it. So Berenguer Dolms is like the enforcer. And so you can really imagine the two of them walking around, well, probably at horses, riding around Catalonia, going to wherever they're supposed to go. It doesn't say which parts of Catalonia, and collecting the money. So that's the scenario here, very clearly. And then on the second to last line, we have somebody reappear who we've already talked about way back in episode 37. On January 30th, we had a document that mentioned Violant's treasurer, Alatsar Golov. Alatsar Golov, I think I didn't realize at the time, back on January 30th, that he is definitely Jewish. He later appeared in some documents after that I was looking at after that episode had been recorded, and I noticed that he was referred to by faith group, so it would say something like Jehu Alatsar Golov in order to mean the Jew Alatsar Golov, who is the treasurer. And here we have him appearing again. So he is very high up in the administration, and we have this moment where we can pause and say, look at the interfaith encounter that's happening here as Alatsar Golov has this role. So Benjamin Gamble is my go-to source when thinking about Jews in the Crown of Aragon, specifically during the reign of Joan and Violant. There's a tremendous amount of scholarly literature about interfaith encounter in the Crown of Aragon over the long term. So one of the most prominent scholars of that field is Brian Catlos, and I'll put a couple of his books into the bibliography for this episode. But there's been just a tremendous amount of scholarship done, even from the early 20th century, especially with Itzhak Bayer, who did a really tremendous work of scholarship on Jews in Iberia. And so there's a very, very well established set of research strategies and sources all about the interfaith encounter that took place in Iberia, especially during these centuries where the peninsula shifted from Muslim rule to Christian rule. And we can see that as the centuries progress, the restrictions placed on Jews become more severe, but it is uneven. So in certain places, certain cities, in certain professions, Jews are celebrated and promoted. And even with individual people, the story is very uneven. I think in particular about Joan, who in his youth was very rabid when it came to the conspiracy theory of Jews stealing communion wafers. It really got him riled up, and he behaved very brutally to particular Jews that had gotten caught up in that conspiracy mongering and had been arrested and accused of stealing communion wafers. And he authorized some torture of them. And so, again, really important to realize that when we are following along the interesting story of Joan and Violant, we're not telling a story of heroes. We're telling a story of interesting people who did, in many cases, reprehensible things, but also did other things that we can look at according to our modern lens, looking back and say, okay, well, that was an interesting resistance that, maybe we are having a kind of revision of in terms of their gender dynamic. That's my big investigation, but it's not in any way to excuse the cruelty that they have exhibited in other situations. Now, let's talk about the Jews who were high up in the administration, especially in the treasury. They were treated in many cases quite well, and they were advocated for during times of crisis. I'm thinking about the anti-Jewish riots of 1391 in particular, which Benjamin Gampel's book really focuses on. And in that book, we have a lot of examples of Joan and Violant really taking care to protect particular Jews that they know that are high up working for them, even as they express a lot of callousness toward communities of Jews that are under attack in the cities around the Crown of Aragon. So this is a very complicated picture, and it's very difficult to paint with a broad brushstroke about questions of morality in regard to the interfaith encounter and these moments of violence and conflict. But documents like this provide, like today's document, provide evidence of the close working relationship that was just a constant feature of the royal family of the Crown of Aragon with members of the Jewish faith. So Again, a lot comes out from this document when we get some specifics, unlike yesterday's document, which was just horridly general. All right, thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.